Hello, biology students, and welcome to the beginning of our second unit, Ecology. So ecology is going to cover essentially a really broad topic. We're going to be working on it for a couple of weeks, or actually probably over a month. So I want to point out something real quick. There is a new calendar for ecology, and it is posted on PowerSchool as well as Google Classroom, new calendar. So reference this in the future. The old one will have disappeared from PowerSchool. However, it could still be found on previous classroom posts. So, all right, let's jump right into our ecology unit. So what is ecology? Ecology is the study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environment. So now we're not only looking about how organisms interact with one another, but we're looking at how organisms interact with their environment. All right, so ecology is the study of interactions between the abiotic components, which are non-living in the environment. So if we can name some, we can think about stuff like the sun, the water. All of these are required for living organisms to survive in their ecosystem, and we'll define that word more specifically, but they themselves are not living. The light is not living, the water is not living, the wind is not living. The nutrients in the soil, like potassium or calcium or sodium, are not living. However, all life requires them, right? The atmosphere itself is not living. All right, so it's how those non-living components interact with our living components, which are the biotic factors in an environment. Examples: plants, animals, microorganisms in the soil. Myself, all human beings would be biotic factors in our environment. So what are some abiotic and biotic factors below? So you can take a moment and pause the video if you'd like, and let's name some off. So the water, the rocks, this fog hanging in the air, that's water vapor, that's all abiotic factors. The trees, looks like some nice spruce trees here. The moss is growing on the rocks, as well as the fish that will be swimming in this river would all be biotic. So why should we study ecology? Ecology provides the basis for understanding how the natural world works, how energy flows and matter cycles, and how these processes are required in order to keep, the ecosystem running healthy and efficiently and, in an unpolluted manner we would like. So ecosystems provide pretty much all goods and services to society. So ecosystem services could range from clean water to clean air. Is there anything you can name you need to survive that isn't part of an ecosystem? And I would challenge you to do so, because even things in my apartment, for example, the door that keeps out intruders or whatnot is made of wood. My roof is made of, plant-based materials like woods and so on and so forth. So essentially everything we need, from the tap water we drink to the air we breathe, is provided by the ecosystem. And we need to realize that human beings are all too often affecting the health of ecosystems in a negative way, but sometimes in positive ways as well. Negative ways would be like global climate change. Positive ways could be, essentially preventing soil erosion or other events that we counteract. Understanding ecology will help us use resources wisely so that all organisms, not only us humans, can survive in a healthy manner on the planet for the indefinite future, for the foreseeable future. It's really interesting because all life on Earth exists within a very small margin. And what I mean by that is there's a very thin layer surrounding the Earth. It can be seen from space, and it's called the biosphere. So the biosphere is the sphere of life that is living, essentially. So we call, Earth is a sphere in terms of its geometrical shape, its planet. It's basically a round ball. I mean, not perfectly round, but we can see that the only part of it that's living is about essentially from the surface of the Earth to a couple kilometers up, and maybe a kilometer or two below the surface of the ocean. Everything below that is the geosphere, and everything above it's the atmosphere. So the air above and the rocks and minerals below, and magma. So quick review from that section 3.1 worksheet. Go ahead and take a moment to review the levels of organization. So you can pause the video right now and do that, and then we'll move on. All right, moving on, let's talk about the levels of organization. So the levels of organization are as follows. We start with the smallest individual, with our elk. Our individual looks like a male elk. Yep, it's got antlers. It's a male elk. So if we think about that male elk, that is the organism itself. It is an individual. Now, if we want to define a species is a group of organisms so similar to one another that they can breed and produce fertile offspring. So it's kind of a hard thing to define a species, but we tend to go by the biological species concept, wherein we define a species by individuals that can interbreed. So if they can't breed, for example, like a mule, and a mule cannot produce fertile offspring because mules are hybrids of horses and donkeys. So a mule would not be considered a species, it's a hybrid. So essentially we define a species as like the elk species, or the donkey species, the horse species, not the mule species, because they can't mate and produce fertile offspring. So if we were to go back to that previous slide, we would see that a population would be a group of elk living in the same area. So they belong to the same species, they live in the same area, they're groups of individuals, and we wouldn't tend to group different populations who live really far away together. So like an elk species that lives in eastern Russia and an elk species that lives in Montana are thousands upon thousands of miles from one another. They never interact. We would not call them one population. We'd call them two separate populations. But each is a population of elk. It's a group of elk. So as we go up the ladder of levels, we can see that a community now factors in populations of different species living in the same environment. So for example, all the elk in this environment, all the moose in this environment, all the mountain lions in this environment, owls, beavers, rabbits, all of those living organisms, groups of those living organisms, would be considered a part of the same community, right? So you could say the forest community is all the living creatures together. However, the community does not yet factor in the non-living components of the environment, like the mountain they live on or the stream that runs next to them. There comes the ecosystem. An ecosystem is a collection of all the organisms that live together in a particular place as well as their non-living environment. So now we factor in the stream, now we factor in the mountains, now we factor in maybe the temperature. It's really cold, like all those abiotic factors that would together make this an ecosystem. So you can notice that ecosystem services don't just come in the form of food from living things. Ecosystem services are like clean water, essentially having habitat to live on, like a land surface to live on. All right. So, and as we go up the ladder even further, we can talk about biomes. Biomes are even larger inclusive groups. And you can have one biome, or biomes are essentially similar topographical and geographical and climate regions that occur in different places around the world. So you could have a biome of boreal or northern forest in Russia and a biome of boreal northern forest in Canada. They can be the same biome, but very different locations, very different ecosystems. But they are similar in enough ways that we'd call them the same biome, if that makes sense. Let me know if it does not. All right, and then lastly, all the biomes put together, be them deserts or boreal forest or mountains or savanna, all those together come together to become the biosphere, as well as the oceans. The biosphere is the entire Earth of living, the entire section of the earth that can sustain life. All right, so now section 3.2 that you're going to be reading in the future, and I also provide audio versions if you would like that. You'll be reading and doing the 3.2 worksheet for Thursday. So these are the topics covered, and we're going to talk about some of them right now. So firstly, what is a food chain? So you probably at least know the concept of a food chain by now. Like there's a phrase like humans are at the top of the food chain, which sometimes is true, but wouldn't be if we were on the African savanna. A lion would have no trouble eating a human. We wouldn't be able to win in a fight against a male lion, or a female for that matter. But a food chain is essentially a simple linear exchange of, or a linear movement or exchange of energy along throughout an ecosystem. Notice how in a food chain, the energy goes where the arrow points. So essentially, the frog is eating the grasshopper. It is getting the energy, so the arrow is pointing from the grasshopper to the frog, so on and so forth, when the snake eats the frog, and when the hawk eats the snake. All right? So the arrow goes where the energy flows is a good way I like to remember it. That's a good phrase. Here's another example of a food chain. Notice linear, just a unidirectional, one direction exchange of energy. So energy, we say, flows. It doesn't cycle like matter does, and matter is essentially the physical particles that comprise us or make up our bodies. Here's another example of a food chain, and many other examples of feeding relationships. In this, the garden snail would eat the thistle, the song thrush would eat the garden snail, sparrowhawk would eat the song thrush, the stoat would eat the bank vole, and the bank vole would eat the blackberries. But in order to, have further understanding of food chains, we need to define what we call trophic levels. So the word troph, or the prefix troph, means food, or energy, I should say, energy. So these are energy levels that represent feeding relationships in an ecosystem. So we say that all energy it comes from the sun, but it all starts at the bottom of our energy pyramid, as we're going to see later, with our primary producers. The primary producers, which can just be said in short as producers because there are not multiple layers of producers. The primary producers are the first beings to receive the energy. And they convert that light energy into chemical energy stored in carbon compounds like starch and glucose. And from there on, they are eaten by our primary consumers, which are the first things to eat the producers. They are herbivores, like a cow or a deer, for example. I saw a bunch of deer today grazing at Maywood. So they were eating the grass. The grass was the producer. The deer was the herbivore, or the primary consumer. And notice how the primary producers support all other above categories. They make their own food, allowing everything above them on that food chain or that energy pyramid to eat. So they're the base of that pyramid. They are the support system. The primary consumers are the herbivores, the ones that eat the producers. Then the ones that eat the primary consumers would be the secondary consumers. These we would say are carnivores. So an example of an herbivore would be like a cow. An example of a true carnivore would be like a mountain lion. Wolves technically are omnivores and eat both, because wolves, contrary to popular belief, will eat berries from time to time. But what eats the secondary consumers? What eats the stuff at the top of the food chain? Really nothing until they die. And once they die, it is the detritivores, the ones that break down dead organic matter. They consume small bits of dead organisms. But don't confuse these with decomposers. Detritivores are like larger things that actually eat dead matter, like kind of an earthworm would be a good example, whereas a decomposer would be a teensy tiny little thing that really breaks down the very atomic structure of things. It doesn't eat so much as just literally break down the chemical structure of stuff. And we'll talk about that later. So while food chains are simplistic and linear, food webs are complex and non-linear. However, we can find food chains from a food web. So for example, the marsh hawk eats the shrew, which eats the grasshopper, which eats the marsh grass. That is all a single food chain, right? But there are many food chains in a food web. So I want you to now, you don't have a partner, unfortunately, virtual folks, but go ahead and take a moment. You can pause this. I'd like you to identify all of the following organisms. So producers, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, detritivores, decomposers. Come on back. Okay, and we're back after a quick commercial break. Okay, so producers. Marsh grass would be an example of a producer. It is getting energy from the sun, and it is producing energy so that it can grow, and then other stuff can eat it. Although the marsh grass doesn't necessarily want to get eaten per se, it's not sacrificing itself intentionally, but it's the producer. It's where the energy starts. Then the grasshopper eats the marsh grass. It's an herbivore. The harvest mouse would be an omnivore because it not only eats the pickleweed, but it also eats the grasshopper. So it can eat plants or animals. It can eat producers or consumers. Then our carnivores would be like the heron, the great blue heron. If you've never seen one of these birds, they're super cool, super lanky, and they're located pretty much everywhere on Earth, even the Galapagos Islands. So these eat the ribbed mussel, the plankton-eating fish, only other consumers. The heron does not eat the producers, so it is a carnivore. Okay, omnivore we talked about. Detritivores would be like our zooplankton, for example. They eat the small, dead, decaying matter called detritus, but they also can eat our algae, which makes them a primary consumer and a detritivore. And our decomposers would be these soil and marine microbes or bacteria that break down the tiny, tiny inorganic stuff, freeing up nutrients for the environment. Now we need to classify these as trophic levels. So trophic levels are a little bit different than consumers and producers in terms of like how we number them. So our first trophic level would be below this first dashed line in this area. Second is right here, third is right here, and fourth is right here. So very few fourth level consumers, or I should say this would not be a fourth level consumer, it'd be a third level consumer. Very few fourth trophic level individuals. So, and the reason being is actually only 10% of all the energy that starts at the bottom gets to the next level. So if we have 100 calories or 1,000 calories here, only 100 would get here, only 10% of that, or 10 would get here, and only 1 calorie would get here. That is why there are very few apex or like top level consumers in an environment like mountain lions, and there's many more blades of grass. There's much more producer material than there is consumer material, or biomass we call it. So the first trophic level are the producers. Second trophic level are the primary consumers, the ones that eat the producers. Third trophic level are the secondary consumers, the ones that eat the stuff that eats the producers. And then our fourth trophic level, or third tertiary consumer, is the thing that eats the secondary consumers. The thing that eats the stuff that eats the stuff that eats the producers. Pretty kind of a tongue twister there. So now can we think of what the wolf would be in this case? So the wolf we would find is a secondary consumer because it eats the stuff that eats the plants. It eats the primary consumer like the mouse, and the primary consumer is an herbivore that eats the prairie grass. The wolf also eats the deer, which is a primary consumer. So that'd be a good example. The largemouth bass here would be a, let's see, you gotta think about this. These are the primary producers. Here's the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumer, and it would be this would be the fourth trophic level. So the trophic level is always one more than whatever consumer it is, if that makes sense, because you include the producers in the trophic level count. Here's a more complex one. We could flesh that one out a little bit if we wanted to, but we'll skip over that one. Notice that humans are towards the top of the food chain. We're eating waterfowl and snapping turtles here. It's really interesting. I don't think I would eat a snapping turtle. Certainly wouldn't stick my finger towards one's mouth. That would be a no-no. And then lastly, we can have the soil food web, which also talks about cycling of nutrients. So notice, food webs much more complex, food chains much simpler, very linear exchange of nutrients and energy. And pay attention to that rule of tens. So if we'd have 1,000 calories here, only 100 would make it to the next level, then 10, then 1, then 1/10. You can have fifth and higher level trophic levels. However, there's so little energy that's left that gets past that far that it's not really worth the organism's while to have to kind of play that game of eating the fly that ate the other thing. Kind of, I forget that who swallowed the fly, who ate the something else. It's a children's book. Anyway, I don't want to ramble on, everybody. So that is the end of our lesson for today. So that is the beginning of ecology. And notice that I think I might have showed you this, but there is a second unit calendar up. This is the second unit calendar for ecology. And then know that you've got to complete the section 3.2 worksheet for next time, for Wednesday night at midnight. So I'll show you where that is real quick before we go. So that is posted on Classroom as our section 3.1 was. So say your third hour biology. I'm yet to post it, but I will post it in the future. October 5th, 6th assignment. So it will be posted here. So here's the text for energy flow. Here's the worksheet. You'll each get a copy. So complete that worksheet for next time. All right, so that'll be it for today. Remember that to also complete this grassland food web activity, and I'll post a short explanation video on that, and then check the calendar for any updates. And if you want to listen to an audio version of that text, there's always that option. All right, that will be that. Have a great evening, everyone.